Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In St. Anselm's Proslogion, chapters 3 and 4 are continuing a line of argumentation that began in chapter 2, which is often called, and this is not Anselm's own term for it, of course, the ontological argument for God's existence. And some people in the 20th century have debated about how many ontological arguments Anselm actually has in Proslogion chapters 2 through 4. We're not going to worry too much about classification like that. We're more interested in what's actually going on here. And you could look at it, if you like these terms, as being like a more high-powered ontological argument, not only arguing that God must exist, but that you can't even coherently think that God doesn't exist. So God has necessary existence in an even higher way. Now, that's an interesting approach, but really what we need to do is look at what's going on within the text, and we'll see that there's even more to be discovered. So we begin with some reflections that are picking up the thread that began in the previous chapter. The previous chapter ended, "There is no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the understanding and in reality." And that is God, right? According to Anselm. So God truly exists, and Anselm is going to pick this up in chapter 3 using this language of truth in an adverbial way. This being, namely God, exists so truly, vera, right, coming from verum in Latin, that it cannot be thought not to exist. And the Latin for this is running along these ways. Utique sic vera est, ut nec cogitari possit non esse. And so you notice there's similar language going on here. God is quo maius cogitari non potest. But there's a few variations of formulas in both this chapter and the previous chapter. And now we're also looking at what cannot be thought, right? So how does Anselm actually argue for this? Well, he's going to say it's possible for us to think something exists, right? To conceptualize, you could say. So he says, potest cogitari esse aliquid. Cogitari can mean think, to think of, to conceptualize, however we want to frame it. Think is just fine, though. So it's possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist. Now, this is a premise in an argument. So if there's any place that you really want to attack this, it's probably that one. Is it possible for us to think of something that cannot be thought not to exist? Or is this sort of an imagination, a fake thought, but whatever we think cannot be thought not to exist actually could be thought not to exist if we just change our perspective? Anselm doesn't worry about that. He actually does think that it is possible for us to think of something like this that cannot be thought not to exist. Now, here's another step in the argument, and it's, consonant with what happened in chapter 2. Such a being that cannot be thought not to exist is greater than a being that can be thought not to exist. Being able to be thought not to exist is kind of a lack of perfection or being or whatever you want to think about it, right? There is a ordering. One thing is greater than the other. So, if that than which a greater cannot be thought, this is the famous formula that is used not only in chapter 2, but throughout the Proslogion. And sometimes we call this Q after quo maius cogitari non potest, right? Which is that than which a greater cannot be thought. If that than which a greater cannot be thought to exist, or to be, can be thought not to exist, then it is not that than which a greater cannot be thought. We could actually think of something greater than it, namely a being that you cannot think not to exist. So what is the identity, you could say, of quo maius cogitari non potest? It not only has to be a being that must exist in reality as well as in the intellect, it also has to include this, being such that it cannot be thought not to exist. If it lacked that, it wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be thought. So, that than which nothing greater can be thought, or Q, quo maius cogitari non potest, exists. And now notice this term, so truly, vere, that it cannot be thought not to exist. This appears to be adding something to our understanding of divine being, right? And he is going to go beyond just providing this argument. Remember that the Proslogion is indeed a meditation on not just the argument, but on God, right? And so he says, this is you, O Lord our God. You exist so truly, O Lord. You cannot be thought not to exist. And, now here's where we get something new. Rightly so. For if some mind could think of something better than you, a creature would rise above the Creator and sit in judgment upon him, which is completely absurd. And sit in judgment is just basically a translation for a term that could be to judge, judicaret, right? So the Creator would be judged by the created. And now, not to say that the created things like us don't judge God all the time. We just don't do it right, according to Anselm. And we sort of exceed ourselves in doing so. So, he goes on and he says, you alone, among all things, have existence, or being, esse, most truly, verissime. So not just so truly, but most truly, at the highest level. God has the highest degree of truth in God's being or existence, and most greatly, maxime, another key term that plays a role in here. And so by the end of chapter 3, we're getting a little bit of a puzzle. He says, well, we started out by saying, taking this from a psalm, the fool says in his heart there is no God, but it's so evident to the rational mind that you among all beings exist most greatly. And he concludes by saying, well, why indeed, except that he is a fool and stupid, stultus et insipiens, right? That's not really an explanation, though. Oh, he's just a stupid person. Well, how is he a stupid person? And that's where we get to chapter 4. How can the fool seemingly do something impossible? How can the fool, on the one hand, say in his heart, which means to think that God does not exist, and yet at the same time, any rational being must see
that God necessarily exists. How can the fool do this? So Anselm says, well, here's where we can make an important distinction. He says that there must be more than one way in which something is said in one's heart or thought, or if we want to be a little bit more literal, there's not only one sense, uno modo, in which something is said to be in one's heart or thought. So saying that something is in our thought is equivocal. It can mean at least two things, and Anselm only talks about two here, in part because that's all he really needs for this explanation. So, in one sense of, saying in our heart or thinking, we think the word, the vox, that signifies the thing. Now, the thing is res, or rem, and that can mean anything. It's a very generic term, right? It doesn't only mean a material thing. God, strictly speaking, isn't a thing like other things, but, as a cognition, sure, that's fine. So, cum vox eam significans. So, when we are thinking about the word, the signifier, rather than the signified, the thing itself, then, we're actually able to say God doesn't exist. Because we're not signifying the thing itself. We're not thinking about God himself, right? He says God can be thought not to exist in the first sense. We can certainly use language to say that. But if we're using the term in the other sense, understanding, intelligitur, the thing is understood, what exactly the thing is, so not just a little bit, having sort of a vague notion of it, but really comprehending it, id ipsum quod res est. That precisely what the thing is, what its being is. In this sense, Anselm says, well, you can't actually deny God's existence. You can't even coherently think God's non-existence in this case. And so he gives sort of a recap. For God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. Whoever understands this properly understands that this being exists in such a way, or has being in such a way, that he cannot, even in thought, fail to exist. So whoever understands that God exists in this way cannot think that he does not exist. So what is Anselm saying here? Just to sort of bring it to a close, if you've got a vague sense of what God is, okay, you can deny God's existence. You can think God's non-existence. If you actually understand what God is, well, at least to the degree that we human beings are capable of, then you can't even think the non-existence or the non-being of God. And he's going to conclude this chapter in a really interesting way. And it's up to you to decide whether you think this has any philosophical implications or not. So he says, thanks be to you, God. This is, a prayer. For what I once believed through your grace, or quite literally here, what I believed, credidi, by you giving it to me, te donante, now I understand it. How? Through you illuminating. So there's this sense that God is casting light in an important way within the mind of the person. Iam sic intelligo te illuminante. And then he says something really even more interesting. It has to do with the will. Even if I not only was unwilling, but willed against believing that you exist, I would still not be able to not understand, intelligere, that you do exist. So even with the willfulness, the stubbornness of the fool, if the fool actually was thinking straight, the fool would see that God must exist. So we get another, if you want to call it an ontological argument, you go on ahead. We don't necessarily need to. We can just call it another argument Anselm is providing for the existence or the being, the esse of God.